welcome to Grandma B's Busy Life. I'm Brenda, and some of my favorite people call me Grandma B. Today we're making bone broth, and we're making bone broth from bones and kitchen scraps. This is stuff that most people would just throw away, and we're going to turn it into a delicious, nutritious broth. If you like this kind of video, please give me a thumbs up. It really helps my channel with the algorithm so that my video can get out to more people. And if you haven't yet, please consider subscribing. I've noticed that about half of the people who watch my videos are not subscribed. If that's you, maybe you could hit that little subscribe button now. So let's get started on the bone broth. I start by putting the meat in the pan. This first bag is raw chicken bones. It is just bones, but it does have some meat attached. The second bag is what's left after I cooked a whole turkey. I just took as much meat off of the bones as I could and put the rest of the bones into this bag, and I just save it until I'm ready to make the broth. This third bag is all of my kitchen scraps. Whenever I'm cutting an onion, celery, carrots, leeks, tomatoes, the part that I cut off, I just make sure it's clean and still fresh, not rotten, and I put it into this bag in the freezer and just leave it until I'm ready to make broth. That bag can make just veggie broth too. You don't have to have bones with it to make broth. It can just be a veggie broth. I also added a few carrots in here from my fridge. A few kitchen scraps that I never add are potato, broccoli, cauliflower. Broccoli and cauliflower get mushy and it makes the broth not as nice looking, and the potatoes have too much starch, so I just don't ever add those in. So I put water in all of my pots. I'm going to add a little bit of salt to each pot. Keep in mind you can always add salt later, but you can't take it out, so start with a small amount. I'm going to turn them on medium-high and till they get hot, and then I'll turn them down to a low simmer and leave them for several hours. So this has been boiling for about an hour, and I've added water into it. As the water boils down, I just want to keep the vegetables and the meat all covered. After it's boiled for about 2 hours, then I quit adding water in. I want the broth to be as condensed as possible. Because I'm bottling this, I want to make sure that I'm using as few bottles as possible. So I want it as condensed as possible. I'd rather have 1 bottle of very condensed broth and have to add water to it later than to have 3 bottles of broth that are ready to go. That's just how I prefer. You can bottle it, just regular strength broth. I like it more condensed. So I'm just going to let this boil for another hour or so, continuing to add water and fill it up. And I don't know if you can see from there, but it's just simmering. It's not boiling hard, it's just simmering. I'll show you how rich the broth is. I got out a white spoon so you could see. It's harder to see with the wooden spoon. But the turkey is not as rich as this chicken is. Look how dark that broth is. Oh my goodness, so beautiful. And this broth, this has both chicken and turkey bones in. Like I said earlier, once they thawed a little bit, I moved some over, but it's kind of in between. And I'm going to mix them all together in the end, so it won't matter that some is richer than others. The reason the chicken is so rich is because it had raw meat on the bones, and the bones had not been cooked yet. So this is the first cooking of these bones. This is the second cooking of the turkey because this was the turkey carcass left over from a turkey that I cooked a couple weeks ago. So it takes a little longer to get that rich, deep broth. But it will get all of that nutrition and flavor out of those bones eventually. It just is going to take a little longer for this pot than the other two. This pot has boiled down to about half, and this pot is a little over half, But this is more than it looks, because this pot that was back here, see all the steam? That pot that was back there, I have put into these pots and then let them boil down. So they've boiled down without any additional water for about 3 hours. I know, 5 hours on the stove is a long time, but that's what gives it that real deep, rich, nutritious broth. So all 3 pots are now combined into these 2 pots, and I'm just going to turn them off and let them cool enough that I can strain them and get all of the food bits out so that we can have just a good, rich broth. It's still warm, but it's cooled enough now that I can get the vegetables and bones out of the broth. I'm just going to pull it all out. Sometimes it's a little tricky. I'm still going to strain it afterwards because I don't want any little bits of food in it. I just want a good clear broth. Do is put it into a container overnight. This broth has some fat in it, and when I bottle it, I don't want the fat in the bottle because it will make it not shelf stable for as long as I would like. I go through my broths pretty fast, so it's really not a huge concern for me, but if I'm going to take the time to bottle it, I want to make sure it has a good shelf life. Now I'm going to pour the broth through this sieve. This will catch any of the big bits of food so that I have that nice clear broth. Can you see how dark that broth is? It looks beautiful. And see, it caught all those little bits. If you're not going to can your broth, you can just freeze it in a container. Just make sure that you don't fill it all the way up because it is going to expand as it freezes. I'm only putting this into these containers now so that I can put it in the fridge, let the broth cool completely. The fat will rise to the top, and then I'll be able to scrape the fat off the top so that when I bottle it, the fat won't be in the bottom. The fat has a lot of flavor, and when I'm freezing it, I just leave it in. But with bottling, like I said before, it's important that it is out of the broth. Now that the broth has cooled overnight in the fridge, you can see that the fat has just settled to the top. There's that thin line. So I'm just going to scrape the fat off the top. It's pretty easy because the bone broth is like a gelatin, and so the fat just sits right on top. And I'm going to throw the fat away. You can definitely cook with it if you want. I just throw it away. And sometimes I get a little bit of the broth in the fat as I'm pulling it off. I don't worry about that. There's still lots of broth there. So I'm just going to do this for each container. Then I'm going to put it in each, I'm going to dump them all into a pot and get it heated back up so that I can start the canning process. I want to show you this before it heats up. It is literally like a jello. Kind of like it's got thick chunks in it. That's how you know it's a good bone broth. If it has that gelatin consistency when it's cold, that means that you've pulled all of the nutrients and goodness out of the bones and it's in your broth. Did you see that chunk? And those chunks will melt down as it heats up. But when it's cold, it should be very gelatinous. Now that the broth is nice and hot, I'm going to get them into the jars, get the lids on top, and get them ready for the pressure canner. How convenient, it perfectly fit into 9 jars. I have hot water with my hot jars, and it's about 2/3 of the way up the side of the jar. You don't want to cover it. This is pressure canning, and it's different than water bath canning because you're using a pressure canner. This is going to heat up and pressure is going to build and steam will start coming out of here. I'll put the pressure gauge on and let it go until it starts to rock, and then when it starts to rock, I'll time it for 20 minutes. This video is not intended to be a how-to pressure can. It is so important that you do your research and you find out all of the information about your pressure canner, because they're all a little bit different, and you find out what you're supposed to do for your altitude. Depending on your altitude, you have to can it at a different pressure. So it's important that you do your research and find out what you need for your area and your canner. For me, I have to have it at 15 pounds pressure and have it rocking for 20 minutes. So it's set on high, and the pot, I'm sure you can hear it boiling. I don't know if you can see the steam coming. You can see the steam coming out the sides, but I don't know if you can see it coming out the top. Probably not, but it is, steam's venting from the top. So I'm going to let it vent for 10 minutes, and then I'll put my pressure gauge on. The timer went off, so I put the pressure gauge on. See, I have the 15 down because in my area we need 15 pounds of pressure. And right now it's just sitting still. It'll start to rock, and when it rocks, then I start the timer for 20 minutes. All right, I let that rock for 20 minutes, and then I turn the temperature off and just let it sit. You want it to completely cool down before you open it. If you try to open it before it's cooled down, there's so much pressure in here, it could be very dangerous. The pressure is completely out. Look how beautiful that is. Oh, I cannot wait. Thank you for sticking around to the end. I'm so grateful to have you here. Please come back every Tuesday and Saturday to see the newest videos. If you hit that notification bell, it'll let you know when I do post a new video. Thank you again. See you again soon.